Well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Nathan Stelter. I'm the president here at the Stelter Company, and want to thank you personally for joining us for our webinar today, as Jen mentioned, The Upside for Planned Giving in a Pandemic and Beyond, presented by Brantley Boyett. Before I introduce Brantley, I just wanted to say a couple quick words around the webinar series, although I think hopefully many of you are familiar with the series as we've been doing it for quite some time now. But as an industry leader, we've always kind of lived by the motto, as the tide rises, so do all boats in the harbor. So we've been providing this webinar series free of charge now for at least half a dozen years. But outside of that, we're focused on really providing innovative solutions, as well as ongoing education for this industry. So we're very happy, as always, to host this complimentary webinar today. And as we have a whole slate of webinars actually throughout the year. This is actually our third webinar of the 2021 series. Previously had Russell James and Catherine Myrie. Those are both recorded and available to watch on our website. Later this year, you're going to hear from some amazing speakers as well. Jen Shang, who teaches us how to love our donors, and then Adrian Sargent in the fall will be sharing some new research into repeat donors. Also, Margaret Holman will be joining us from New York, giving tips on how to use planned gifts to solve donor problems. You can register for all our webinars, as always, on our website at stelter.com/webinars. That's also where we've archived the previous webinars. And be sure, as always, we'll obviously be pinging you via email and social media to remind you to sign up for those webinars throughout the year. So back to our talk today. Brantley Boyett, as you see, Brantley there, co-founder of and president of Giving Docs. He's a former, and as we all like to say, recovering attorney, having practiced for over a decade before founding Giving Docs back in 2015. Currently teaches law and entrepreneurship at Duke University School of Law. And Giving Docs, under Brantley's leadership, has partnered with Dan Ariely. If you haven't seen Dan, it's amazing. It's done some amazing work in the behavioral science lab, specifically out there at Duke, in the Center for Advanced Hindsight, which really seeks to use behavioral science to make the world happier, healthier, and wealthier. Brantley received his JD and BFA in economics from the University of Texas in Austin, and now lives, as I mentioned earlier, in Durham, North Carolina. I'm excited to introduce you to Brantley, and Brantley, it's all yours.
Thanks, Nathan. And thanks everyone for joining us today. The talk that we're giving today is about the upside for planned giving in a pandemic and beyond. And a lot of the things that we'll be talking about today are, kind of what's happened in the pandemic and how it makes people feel. And this is all guided by and informed by our work with Dan and the Center for Advanced Hindsight. So when Giving Docs partnered with Dan and the center a few years ago, and we went to join that science lab, they identified, the problem. One of the problems that we were trying to solve was, how do we get people to think about estate planning at all? And a lot of the research that we did revolved around some of the topics that we're going to address today. So there is a kind of a sciencey vibe to this talk, but hopefully we can ease into it and it'll be both entertaining and informative. So, I wanted to start out by saying that the pandemic started, roughly March 10th or 11th last year in our minds for the most part. I remember the night that, I was at a friend's and Tom Hanks got COVID and the NBA got canceled and all of a sudden everything got really real. And up to that point, we were all kind of wondering if it was gonna be that bad or, would we have to really shut down? And then, everything kind of shut down at once. And from that point forward, we had these kind of constant reminders of our vulnerability. And there was this period where we weren't sure what was going to happen. And all we saw in the media was nonstop coverage of the pandemic, people in the hospitals, ventilators, people dying. And we were forced to consume, all of this information about, our potential death. And it became a part of our lives in a way that no one really expected and no one in our lifetimes had really experienced before. So we want to frame this talk with, this has happened. This is something we've all been forced to think about. So what happens in our minds when we're all forced to think about death in that way for a long time? And then apply that to what's happened in the estate planning world and how planned gift officers have had to deal with this, and then how there might be an upside to this, and how we plan for kind of the new reality that we're all living in. So, once again, as I said earlier, at the center, we looked at this problem first when we got there. How do we get people to plan their estates at all? And we looked at, why people don't do it, and we researched it, and we interviewed people. And, the two things that are usually stated first are, it takes time and it costs money. But those aren't the real reasons why people don't plan their estates. The real reason is people don't like to think about dying. People run from thoughts of death. If we were all looking at each other in the eyes and I looked at you and told you that you're certainly going to die at some point, you would run away and not want to talk to me ever again. But we know that to be true. And for most people, prior to the pandemic, we just don't think about death a lot if we can avoid it. And now that this has been going on for over a year, and while things look up, we're not really through it. We can look back and say, what has been the impact on people's psychological mindsets because of this happening? And a really rough stat and this is maybe aged a bit, but 1 in 3 Americans has lost either close friend or family member to the pandemic at this point. So we're all aware that this could affect any one of us. It's kind of indiscriminate as to age. Certainly older people are more susceptible, but we all know of or heard of a younger person that this has happened to as well. So let's go back to April of 2020, when we're all sitting in our houses kind of wondering what's going to happen next. And we're talking to our friends that are planned gift officers. And this was a very uncertain time, to say the least, for people in this profession, because they didn't want to look opportunistic. They needed to still do their jobs. Events were getting canceled for lots of nonprofits, which meant that planned giving officers were actually receiving more pressure from the top to make up the shortfall of other departments in nonprofits, while also being told that their budgets were being cut across the board. And generally, as a planned gift officer, your job is empathy and communicating with donors, learning about them, meeting with them in person. And as empathetic people, you don't want to look like you're making the ask because a lot of people might be dying, right? So certainly we all heard stories about marketing that went out in March of last year and April of last year, where a very vocal minority of donors were righteously indignant about being asked for a planned gift when they were terrified of their own death. And so planned gift officers just couldn't do their jobs the way that they wanted to. They felt timid about making the ask. They couldn't market in the same ways that they had before. And they couldn't meet people in person, which has traditionally been, a big part of the job. So knowing that things got disrupted and things have gotten a little bit back more to normal at this point, I want to dig in on some of these scientific principles that we've researched and studied in our work, and share with you kind of what these things mean. So the first one that I'm going to go over here is the concept of mortality salience. So, different people frame it different ways, but it's a person's awareness that their own death is inevitable. And when you say, a young person has very low mortality salience, that's because they think they're invincible and they can't really conceive of their own death. I mean, you're in college, you weren't worried about when you were going to die. And on the flip side of that, someone who's survived cancer or, has a terminal illness is very mortality salient. They've been forced to consider their own death for a long period of time. and they're much more comfortable with those thoughts because of that. And so scientists, when they're working out this, looking at mortality salience, they generally in the past have looked at ways to increase someone's mortality salience in order to measure their changes in the behaviors that they have. So what happens when we have a pandemic and we're all forced to think about dying? That is a massive mortality salience inducing event. If you were, before the pandemic, if you were forced to write down your bucket list or, think about you planning your estate, or if you were forced to watch a 40-minute talk about mortality salience, we would say you were induced to think about your own death. And so this is something that's now happened across the population, kind of indiscriminate of age and indiscriminate of the other factors that might make someone more mortality salient in the past. And we see it on TV, we know people that are sick. And so we're all just kind of forced to consider our own death because of this event. So what does that mean in general for estate planning? Clearly, there's more of it. Because people were forced to think about their death a lot in the past year, we saw a lot more estate planning. As an anecdote from a mentor, probate attorney here, and trust and estate planning attorney that I know in Texas that we've been friendly with for many years. She's practiced in Texas for 50 years doing trust and estates. We spoke last April, and I asked her how she was doing. And she said, honestly, Brantley, I'm not doing well. Not only do we have a deluge of new clients coming in, pretty much everyone that we knew that was due for an update has now flooded my office with requests to fix these documents. And what I've been having to do is get people on Zooms for 15 minutes and watch them, force them to create holographic wills, because I don't know exactly when we're going to be able to get their paperwork done. And that is, as far as I know, has pretty much continued to the present day. Estate planning attorneys have been booked up, online services, more people are planning their estates that way as well. So people are doing this because they're more aware of their own death. And because it's front of mind, and they're worried about their family members, or they're worried that the organizations they care about might get left out, they're actually going out and doing it. I wanted to talk about a couple of the health responses to mortality salience before we get into the bigger picture, so you can have an idea of how scientists look at this. So generally, you see positive responses to mortality salience and negative responses. And in the health sphere, health conducive behavior would be wearing masks, social distancing, sanitizing your hands, staying in, eating healthier, potentially, quitting smoking because of this. And then there's avoidance responses that we have as well. So some people might refuse to wear their masks or deny that there is a pandemic at all. And we've certainly seen those types of behaviors as well. And avoidance measures are generally, the negative responses to mortality salience. And we'll get into more of those in just a bit here. I want to back it up a bit and go to kind of this higher overarching theory that, mortality salience kind of came out of. And it's this this terror management theory that was first introduced in the 70s. And the best way I can describe terror management theory is that it's this idea that, we have two conflicting thoughts in our brain at all times, and we're kind of at war. And one is that we want to survive. So humans have a very strong survival instinct, and anything that makes us face our own death causes us to feel terror. And that is something that's really gotten humans far along in the whole evolutionary process. But on the other hand, humans have evolved to be so intelligent that at some point, usually early on in our lives, we come to understand that death is inevitable, and that we will certainly die at some point. So knowing that you're going to die for sure, and then desperately wanting to be alive are in conflict at all times. And we've developed psychological ways to handle that. And one of those ways is that, we build our own cultural worldview, that life has meaning, even though we're certainly going to die, and that the things that we are doing here are important. And these worldviews kind of give us a buffer against that knowledge that we're going to die, that we're impermanent, that we're vulnerable, that, life could be over really at any moment. And then, of course, with the pandemic, constantly being faced with death, we have heightened terror. So, of course, this should heighten, the response that the psychological response that our brain makes in response to that. So let's talk about some of the bad stuff that happens when there's a pandemic and some of the good stuff. Negative effects that we've seen, obviously increases in antisocial behavior. People turtle up. Of course, we were all forced to be antisocial. We were told to stay in our homes, but then, that causes increased anxiety as well. So we've all heard about the COVID-19, people gaining weight. We saw that substance abuse was up during the pandemic, the alcohol sales were up. We saw that there was an increase in domestic violence and violence in general. And these are all kind of responses to being afraid. And then, one that I discussed earlier, denial of the threat. A significant portion of the population found it was easier to deny that there was a pandemic at all. It really allows you to get along with your life. And then another really powerful one that we saw was extreme polarization of people's political positions. So you get this kind of tribe thing going on where people want to be a part of their tribe and they don't like other tribes. And that is one of the negative effects. And then we also see increases in prejudice as well. So there are a lot of bad behaviors that can arise out of this, being afraid for your own life all the time. And then we also see a lot of positive effects, and that's what we want to focus on today here. Increases in pro-social behavior, of course, volunteerism. We saw a huge increase in volunteerism in the past year. Donations to not all, but some charities are up, specifically charities that feed the poor, Black Lives Matter. All these charities that were top of mind had huge increases in donations in the last year. And then you see the kind of good things that people do in their own lives. Like, I know that about 2 weeks in, after sitting at home alone, confused for a couple of weeks, I immediately started scheduling Zoom meetings with all of my friends and family and making them weeklies and really spending time with people however I could in a way that I hadn't really before. We all know people that got super fit during the pandemic. Not one of those myself, but good on them. People that learned new languages, people that, put out a new music album while they had the extra time, and people that started new entrepreneurial endeavors. So a lot of people found this as a really great catalyst to change their lives in the world for the better. And so we want to focus on how we can accentuate those types of behaviors and what it takes to get there. This is from a paper I'm going to reference shortly here, and there's going to be 2 scientific papers that I reference in this talk, both of which I'll upload with the deck to the folder that you guys have access to. So this first quote is kind of what I was talking about before. People can be motivated to enhance their physical health and grow their goals, be more positive people with higher standards and better belief system. They can strengthen their relationships and encourage the development of peaceful, charitable communities. So there have been a lot of studies on this, and people want to feel like they're a part of something if they believe that they might die. So charitable communities are a really important part of that. Another really important part is religious communities as well. So people, if you're afraid that you're going to die, it helps to, have a belief system where you may transcend your death. And we'll talk more about that shortly. But, an interesting thing that we looked at when we were trying to get people to plan their estates in the past was we can induce mortality salience briefly, but we've never seen an event like this where it's just a constant fire hose of people being forced to think about their own death. So, and when they do, we know that the longer we get someone to think about their own death, the more likely they are to think about the world after they're gone, what happens to their families, and what their legacy really is. So this is that first paper that I was referencing. It's called When Death is Good for Life, Considering the Positive Trajectories of Terror Management Theory. It was released in 2012. I threw up this this flow chart because I think it's really great, and you may want to dig in more later, but it's a heuristic model of positive terror management. And they kind of flow out what happens in a person's mind when they have a conscious death thought activation. So people perceive the risk and then figure out what their coping resources are, whether that's reduction or avoidance of the threat or taking on more healthy behaviors. And then they think about the relevance of their life goals and intrinsic and extrinsic goals. And what that all leads to is a continued non-conscious death thought activation, that kind of in the background mortality salience, and the positive outcomes that can come out of that. So health and environmental care, pro-social behavior, tolerance, compassion, commitment, love, intimacy and romance, community involvement and development, intergroup cooperation, peaceful coexistence, creativity and exploration. These are all the positive things that can happen once we're forced to think about our own death for a little while. So the question, of course, for this audience is, can increased mortality salience lead to an increase in plain giving? And I think our answer is, of course, it already has. On that same conversation I had with the attorney last April, she told me that part of the stress that she was feeling was that a lot of these people wanted to do complex gifts, in that she was trying to balance making sure that everyone got estate plans and also make sure that these gifts got completed. And even though there's been less of an ask in the last year, we've seen an uptick in plan gift commitments across the board and with everyone that I've talked to in the last year. And the impact is still being recorded, but all the signs pointing towards 2020 having been a really good year for plan giving, and that lines up with everything that we're hearing from plan gift officers that we talk to. So I want to dig in on another scientific paper, which I love, and the title of it is A Little Piece of Me, When Mortality Reminders Lead to Giving Others. And it was written by Leah Dunn, Catherine White, and Darren Dahl, who are professors at the University of British Columbia Sauder School of Business. And it was published this last year, or the summer, and they did some interviews around it, because what's really interesting about this study is that they did it before the pandemic. And their hypothesis in doing the study was they wanted to see if inducing or heightening mortality salience could have a positive impact on donation behaviors in general. And it's great that they did it before the pandemic actually happened, because this study wouldn't be possible now. We're looking at, it was done in a time when people weren't forced to think about their own deaths. And now that we've had this happen, we won't be able to do another study like this for a little while because the effects are lasting. So looking at, this paper is pretty dense. It's got 5 different studies and then a number of follow-on studies. I'm going to look at the first 3 with you guys and talk about those. but once again, that paper will be in the folder for anyone who'd like to read the whole thing. But in the first study, they were looking at mortality salience and real donation behavior. So I want to actually skip ahead and kind of talk a little bit about how that study was done. So they got a number of people to not telling them what the study was for, and all the people were asked to bring a book to the study. And they had a control group where people were asked to consider a typical day in their own life. And then they had the group they were actually trying to measure, which was these people were asked to contemplate their own death. So imagine you're in a study and someone sits you down and they say, okay, I want you to think about your typical day and just write down what that's like. And then same thing on the other side, except I'm asking you to contemplate your own death, and I want you to tell me what happens after you die. And that is, one of the ways that scientists induce mortality salience when they do these types of studies. So in group 2, they found, and then after they did these different asks from these people, they then asked them if they would donate the book that they brought to charity. And they found that group 2 was more likely to donate their book. However, it was only if they were offered a chance to write something in the book, to sign it and leave a message to whoever was going to receive the book. So what they were showing here was that mortality salience leads to an increase in actual donations of products for books in this study, for example, but only if the person can link that item to their self. So taking it further in study 2, they kind of flipped it, and they gave people the option. They told people they were going to give away the book either way. And then they did the same kind of think about your typical day, or think about and write about your own death. But in this case, they were given the option to write in their book before they gave it away. And the people who had been asked to think about their own death were much more likely to write in the book. So what they're showing here is that if someone's been forced to think about their own death and they have to give something away, they're going to be much more likely to try to tie themselves to that thing that they're giving away. And then in this third test, they specifically asked people to bring in an item that was very connected to themselves. So not just any old book, but something they really cared about. And they did a similar activation where, think about your typical day and think about your own death. And they found that people were very much more likely to give away the item when under the mortality salience condition, if it was something they really cared about. So they're working towards this idea. All of these studies kind of point to this idea that mortality salience heightens one's desire for transcendence. How do we live on after our own death? And a lot of our defense mechanisms that I talked about earlier are relevant to that as well. So these studies dispositively showed that that's the outcome. And then relevant to this industry, because everyone here is like, well, we don't all just want to get books, Brantley, we'd like to get some money. They did a follow-on study about monetary donations, and the scientists tested, would someone be more likely to leave a monetary donation if that would lead to the donor's name being put up in public in a permanent place. And they're pushing, once again, this theory that transcendence is kind of the driving force behind the donation. And they showed that, once again, it's much more likely that someone will leave a donation if they feel like this will help them live on past their death. So the outcome of all these studies is that they want people to, in the giving space, to focus on this idea of symbolic immortality, as it were. Where do my possessions go when I pass on? What does that do for other people? And how can I live on through those possessions? So their advice to the nonprofit industry was that anything that you can do to connect the self to something that's more lasting, like plaque, murals, totems, permanent displays, is going to greatly increase the chance that someone will make this kind of donation. And then they also acknowledged, because it's really cool, they got interviewed a lot of times about this paper because it came out after the pandemic started and it was extremely timely, that, you know, they acknowledge that mortality salience is higher right now. People are aware of how fragile life can be. And if a possession is linked to your identity, it could have the ability to transcend the self. So if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this talk, it's the idea that you can focus on this idea of transcendence with donors and get creative with it in a way that maybe you haven't before. I know a lot of schools have plaques on the walls, and there are other ways that you can do this, but we maybe haven't thought about this hard enough as an industry, and that's what I want everyone to walk away from this talk thinking about, is how can we do better at making our donors feel like their gift is a way to transcend this mortal plane. So in application, we would say that, you know, we want to emphasize a connection to something that lives on past the life of the donor. Of course, legacy, society, inclusion should be highlighted and encouraged. Showing people how other people have lived on through this type of transcendence, I think, is also really important. And, you know, that means telling, of course, donor stories for people that have passed, and highlighting how that impact lives on and that person's legacy lives on, I think, is now more important than ever. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how long these effects will last. It looks like there's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, but we keep hearing news, you know, like with things going on in India, we don't really know when this is going to end, if there's going to be a new variant. You know, the US has made great progress this year, and it's really starting to feel like life is getting back to normal somewhat. But these feelings of terror are traumatic, and trauma doesn't easily disappear or dissolve. So it stands to reason that these feelings, you know, this heightened mortality salience is going to continue on for a long time into the future. And what I want you guys to think about is, you know, how can we better serve donors by being aware of this and giving them what they need in terms of transcendence? Like, how can we help them, nudge them towards creating legacies which we know to be good for people? We know from our work with the lab that people that create these kind of gifts are happier people. We know from the work of Dr. James that they donate more, they volunteer more, they make more money than people that haven't. So people are primed kind of to do this right now, and the plant giving industry should benefit for a long time because these feelings aren't going to quickly go away. And on this last slide, you know, we talk about action plans. So I want to, you know, leave you guys with a few insights here. One is, if you stopped making the ask, or you felt shy about it, or you were still confused about when the right time was to make the ask, it's certainly now. People are going to be planning their estates anyway. Many already have. Many are thinking about estate planning in a way that they hadn't in the past. Many people are open to changing their estate plans more often. So whatever the lull was in the ask, it's time for it to stop. You know, we need to not be shy about making legacy appeals. Legacies are good for people. Don't shy away from that. These help people live richer lives. So it's not opportunistic just because there's a pandemic. We want to, we want to help people in the organizations that we work with. So another thing, like I talked about before, is spotlighting donors, and specifically stories of people that have passed on but left something meaningful behind, something tangible to the organization, whether that's a scholarship or their name's on a plaque, or what other creative ways you have to show that that donor has transcended. Showcasing impact, of course, in similar lines, and then provide tangible things, whether that's a mural on the wall or whether the plaque is digital. It doesn't have to be something really expensive that your organization has to spend a ton of money on. You could have a dedicated page on your website that you direct people to, and just seeing their name in writing there is very powerful. And then, make it easy, connect them with people that can help them. Know that people are in need of help learning about estate planning. So get them proper education so that they know what they need to do for themselves and their families, and educate them about why this is important, and the impacts that they can make, and also the benefits to their friends, family, and the organizations that they care about. And with that, I will open it up to Q&A.
Thanks, Brantley. We do have some questions that came in. I'll go ahead and start with one from Emily. Emily is asking, and you just spoke about this a little bit in your last slide, if the concept of transcendency is specific to a physical public recognition, or could it be something that is, say, a named fund that is the people inside the organization know about it, but it's not necessarily public facing?
So, of course, that's a great question. And of course, the studies that we reference here and the testing focused on these physical, tangible things. And I would posit that we could be much more creative in that space, that it doesn't necessarily need to be a thing, but it could focus on the name recognition. It could be digital. It could be a fund, exactly, just naming the fund without doing any kind of outside physical tangible thing can also be really powerful. We've had kind of a shift in society where we used to focus a lot on tangible items. A great example is dollars to Bitcoins, right? Things are shifting, and we should, as a whole, this industry should be thinking about how we can be creative with these ideas and introduce new ways for people to transcend.
We have a question from Rebecca. She says, is there any past research during a somewhat similar event that shows the long-term effect of this type of heightened mortality salience in people, perhaps from the flu epidemic of the 1918s or sustained wars in other countries?
Not that I'm aware of. So terror management theory kind of bubbled up in the 70s or maybe the 60s at the earliest, and mortality salience was born out of that theory. So most of this research into this these psychological behavior research is relatively new, and that's why this study that Leah Dunn and Catherine White and Darren Dahl did is unique in addressing how mortality salience affects donation intentions. And we hope that as these types of studies become more prevalent, that we'll be prepared to revisit them in this type of environment. And I assume that there are some scientists working on these types of things right now, but we don't know. I haven't heard about them yet, outside of the research that we do with the lab.
There's a couple other questions around age and the studies in particular. I'll kind of combine two of these here. One, just in regards to the studies on mortality salience, were there any age parameters? Do you recall if there was any age parameters around that?
They tested a wide age range for the study that they did out of Vancouver. And I think the median age was 41. So they do, I can pull those numbers, but it was basically young to old when they were running those studies.
Okay. Well, and Bruce had kind of a similar one as well regarding the research that people don't like to talk about estates because they don't like to think about dying. He shares anecdotally that's not necessarily been his experience with older 70 plus donors, but was curious if that changes as people get older.
Absolutely. So as people get older, they become more mortality salient. And a lot of the research shows this, that these kind of reactions, a lot of the negative reactions are more prevalent in younger people, and a lot of the positive reactions are more prevalent in older people because they've been exposed to thoughts of death just more over the course of their life. As you get older, you know more people that have died. You're more likely to have had a serious illness. So there definitely is there are different distributions across different age ranges.
We have another question. I think, Nathan, you might have some comments on it as well regarding the types of language that you would recommend that you use in your conversations and your marketing to remind donors of their own mortality without it coming across as insensitive or as a scare tactic.
So I know that, and Nathan, you're welcome to jump in here too. I know that we, from a behavioral science standpoint, one of the tools in the toolbox is fear. If you want to get someone to do something, fear or shame are useful tools for certain outcomes. We have always operated from the mindset that those are not useful in the estate planning sphere because of how that magnifies, the terror that you feel towards death. So we, at least in our efforts, we try to be very gentle in that respect, without citing specific examples. Nate, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree. Fear definitely in our space, not the way to go. I think part of what we've seen that has been really helpful is, and I'm hopeful this is one of those things that's going to come out of the pandemic, is being authentic and transparent with donors around these conversations. Don't kind of tiptoe around it. I mean, being transparent, authentic around why you're asking, why you're bringing this, and being a resource. I mean, I think that was one thing that really stood out the last 9 months, where we saw folks just extending a helping hand. Hey, we're all this is such a unique part of all of our lives, that because we're all facing very similar thoughts, and just being authentic and transparent in regards to that. And I think that's the biggest thing. You start trying to put it under a different umbrella of, like you say, like fear or something like that, people get suspect. People start questioning your motives. So I think that's one of the biggest things, hopefully, that will stay with us coming out of this.
We had a question that was submitted on the registration form. The organization is planning a virtual seminar for plan giving in June, and just curious if you have any thoughts on what they should focus on during the seminar, given the pandemic and where we're at right now.
I would direct them to, consult that last slide. Those are action items in there, things that they can talk about. Certainly, we want to ask more. We want to, not be opportunistic, but realize that this is a unique time, that there's a real opportunity here, and to focus on how can we reach donors where they are with education, encouragement, and also, like Nate said, just be transparent with the ask and the why. And get over, I'd encourage everybody to get over that timidity, that fear that came along with the beginning of the pandemic, and not worry about how this might be perceived, because the net positive is so overwhelming.
We have a couple questions around donors and their stories. And so one from Jesse, one from Rhonda here. I'll start with Jesse since she was a minute earlier. Do we know if a story-based totem has more effect than a name only? Like the book example you shared where they got to write a short note. Should we be looking for ways for their stories to live on?
I think the answer is probably yes. We haven't, it hasn't been specifically tested yet out in the real world, but it makes sense from if you compile the other studies that have been done, that if you were able to effectively do that, that it would be measurably more powerful. But once again, coming from the lab, I'm not allowed to draw conclusions without doing a live test, and we'd be instructed to write out the hypothesis and then figure out a way to actively test that against the control group.
And I would say from a marketer, anecdotally, 100% agree. Yeah, I mean, but from a scientific standpoint, that's a whole nother ball of wax. And Rhonda's kind of talks to, and it is something that organizations sometimes struggle with. Do most organizations have any trouble getting their donors to share their story? She's long felt that the anecdotal story of what one has accomplished with the gift is the best encouragement of the next donor. And I would agree, and it is tough, but I think there's also, when storytelling is another cool thing, I think, and Brantley, I'd be curious your thoughts on this, that's come out of, obviously going into the pandemic, it made sense, and even more so now, but on a couple different fronts. It's the impact gifts have had, that side of storytelling, but also the donor side from a stewardship standpoint too. I didn't know if you had any other thoughts.
We if you've ever read Dan Ariely, you know that there's an extreme focus on the power of storytelling, and he's an outstanding storyteller, and when he talks, and really great at conveying things to people like that. So we're always trying to do that, and I think that's a great point about focusing on the stewardship and the story of the donor at this point. How can we help donors feel like they're a part of the story and that their story lives on, and that we're not just telling someone else's story to them to inspire them, but that this story can be theirs, and it'll be a story about them that's told to other people in the future. I would look at it from that lens.
Betsy asks, in light of the idea of mortality saliency, what age group would be most receptive?
Not sure I understand the question.
I think she's asking what age group to approach based on the research that you talked about today.
Oh, sure. So I think what I'd like you to take away is that each age group is more approachable than they were before. So even those younger people who were just completely out of the realm of talking to, people under 30 who might have never considered their own death, might now actually, it's a section of those have planned their estates. We know that young people have passed away. So older people, even more so, a lot of older people, the vast majority of the people who have passed away from the pandemic have been older people. So they've had more fear and more exposure. But I think at each level of age group, you're just going to have a heightened opportunity to engage in these kind of talks, whether it's estate planning, plan giving, thoughts of death. It's just across the board.
Deborah wants to thank you for this information. First of all, she thought, it was very useful. She asks, what is a good way to begin this type of a conversation with a donor of hers who's been a long-term annual donor, and the person just had turned 90 last week?
Nate, that seems to be
Yeah,
something
no, and
all
I
the
see.
time.
Yeah, no, again, and I was going to ping Deborah, and we can kind of talk a little deeper about this particular individual. I'm happy to do that. But yeah, no, I think part of that's just based on what we know about the individual donor, what their connection is to the organization. I think, Deborah, you followed up here. Do I say state students are so grateful for your support over the years? Have you given given the thought of leaving a legacy? I think there's variations of that based on the connection the donor has with you. And so I'm more than happy. You can ping me. I know we'll put our email addresses up here. I think you can ping me afterwards.
So I think you talked a little bit about this earlier, Brantley, but we have someone that's wondering that their monthly giving donors generally don't reach the level of giving that's required for a naming type of an opportunity. So to get their public recognition, they're not likely able to hit that level. So do you have any other suggestions to get them to commit without having to be quite that big of a donor?
Yeah, so I would look at, actually, and this applies to across the board to the industry. I would look at these naming rules are generally based on a cost to deliver the upside that goes along with that. So whether it's getting the print out, getting the human resources associated with cultivation of that person, there's generally like a cost benefit analysis where someone gives enough and they get onto this thing. And I would think about figuring out ways that maybe cost less to service those lower tier donors in a way that's still meaningful, because we know that a lot of people, whether they're younger or they just don't have that much money to give right now, can be really good plan giving prospects and should be cultivated and should be recognized and celebrated and be a part of the story and have them think of themselves as part of that story. So I would get creative in ways that you can recognize those people, but while also keeping in place the naming recognition system that you already have for those higher tier donors.
I see Nathan was just answering the question I was going to ask
sorry.
privately. I'm going to go ahead and ask it because I'm not sure I know. You mentioned doing a holographic will in the very beginning of the presentation, and someone's wondering if you can explain that a little more.
Oh yeah, that's when someone just takes a pen and paper and writes out their will. So the reason why that estate planning attorney was doing that, once she signed people, she would then have to go draft very complex documents. And she figured out 40 years ago, the first time someone signed her up and then passed away on her before the documents could get signed, that she was every single person that came in their office was gonna do a holographic will, because at the end of the day, any will is better than no will. So while you can't get everything you might want in there in terms of estate planning, you can solve a lot of major problems by getting someone to get that done.
Yep. Sorry, Jen, it's almost not verbatim, but pretty close to what I just responded.
Pretty close. I can see that you're typing to her. So.
It's real time. There's one here that Ann shared around just thoughts on folks who have joined a legacy society and any insights on what donors want from organizations once they've joined a legacy society, especially in lieu of, the best way to honor them, since maybe not possible events currently, which were, traditional stewardship things, are not possible or popular right now for legacy donors.
Great question. And we look at this and think about this a lot. So people do want to be recognized and celebrated. It doesn't have to be expensive events. I think, once again, just a personal touch of, scheduled phone calls. Something that I do in my professional career is people that I, want to continue to connect with, I'll schedule 3-month recurring meetings, right? And just taking that time, whether it's 15-minute check-in or whatever, I think is a low cost way of celebrating people and keeping them involved with the organization. online legacy society events. You have to get creative. And I think that there's no catch-all answer for the industry at large, that it's going to depend on the type of organization it is, the affinities of individual donors, and that an intake process when someone joins the legacy society is probably an important piece of that. How would you like to be acknowledged? How would you like to be interacted with moving forward? How can we let you know that we really appreciate you in a way that's meaningful, and not everybody's going to be the same. So I think you can capture a lot of that in that initial conversation if you're able to have it. And then otherwise, sometimes you just got to get creative with the constraints of the budget in the real world, and not having events for a while.
And I'll follow up on that last part. I love that last part too. Again, on making it personal, making it relevant to whatever, because everybody has different feelings in regards to how they want to stay connected, be recognized. But I 100% agree. And I think this, again, another maybe positive coming out of this last year is having to rethink stewardship sometimes. I mean, stewardship of legacy donors used to be the gala, the event, insert whatever here, but there is opportunity. People are looking for connection coming out of this last year, and authentic connection. So I think there's some really cool personal ways to connect with folks now, and kind of continue to build relationships that we maybe didn't think about or maybe didn't have time for pre-pandemic.
With that, thanks, Nathan. We're going to wrap up. We're almost out of time. So I did want to say, if you had additional questions that have popped up, maybe you didn't get a chance to put them in, or we didn't get them answered today, you can reach out to Brantley. His email address is on the screen, brantley@givingdocs.com. If you have questions about the webinar series or about Stelter, our products and our services, you can reach out to Nathan at stelter.com, or myself, jen.lennon@stelter.com. And you can always visit our website at stelter.com. And then finally, one of the questions that came in a lot was, can I get this deck? Can I, see the recording? And the answer is absolutely. And also, Brantley mentioned 2 or 3 different papers. If you can share those with me, I will make those available too. So we'll have the recording, we'll have the handouts that you guys saw today, and then the papers that Brantley mentioned. And those will be posted on our webinar library, which is stelter.com/webinars. Look for them to be in place by Friday for you to access. I will send an email out to let you know when they're ready for you. So you can just wait for my email if you want. Otherwise, they'll be there Friday. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for being here. And thank you, Brantley, for spending the last hour with us, and Nathan. And the last time I looked, I think we had about 450 plan giving professionals on the line with us. So what a tremendous audience, and what a great use of our last hour of our day. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks, Brantley. Everybody.
Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.